Great, thank you. So if you haven't already noticed, we've got a terrific panel here today, and they're really representing various segments of the financial services industry across a couple of different streams, so from consumer banking to insurance to financial super apps. And what we're going to do over the next 35 minutes or so is get down to some real, tangible, practical aspects of how digitization is transforming banking and insurance businesses, and how actual practitioners in the market are delivering, managing new ways of engaging with clients, uncovering demand in some less likely places, and looking at different patterns globally in terms of how demand is developing and how partner companies are working together with each other. We'll start just by talking a bit about segmentation and how companies are segmenting their client base. You know, by some estimates, there will be about, or maybe there are just about 5 billion active smartphone users globally today. And when you look at that number and you look at how quickly the pace of technological adaptation has been over the past couple of years, and add to that the fact that consumers' patterns of work, patterns of leisure are a far cry from what there used to be, it has a lot of implications for the way companies segment their client base. So maybe we can start with Archie. You know, Archie, traditionally, when I would have thought about segmentation, call it 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I was looking at how I would segment my own client base, I would do so along very traditional lines. Demographics, maybe age group, maybe work status. But how is all of this leading you and Cogni to segment clients a bit differently than we might have segmented them traditionally, either because the segment didn't exist or because there are different demand patterns that are emerging?
When we started Cogni, gig economy used to be the thing. It's a two-sided marketplace, supply and demand. Now gig economy is part of the economy, so it's a norm. And typically when banks started servicing these customers, they had irregular income. They were leading their life in a digital fashion. And segmentation was a little bit harder for them to actually service them as clients. The reason why is because they haven't built complex systems that understood the different needs of the user. So at Cogni, when we started Cogni as a gig economy platform, we quickly pivoted as understanding that gig economy is part of the norm, and we'll have to go back from the way we start onboarding the user from your KYC aspect of it and start building complex systems around from the KYC by connecting various unstructured data across the ecosystem, like your census data, your RP data, and trying to understand who you are as a person. And for us, understanding that component is more important to us, and that's what we're trying to achieve. And then, in addition to that, provide value-added services, experiences, products to that sector. I'm a very believer believer in singularity. As we move away from a physical world into the digital phase, people's lives, behaviors change a lot. You know, typically there used to be a time. Some might agree, some may not agree with me, but you know, you finish college, pay your mortgage, get married, get a house, pay off those things. It's an easy segmentation. You have all kind of predictability with which business models have been built upon. Now, we are living in a hyper-connected world where you know, you spend more money on experiences, you don't get into mortgages, you get married late. And so your spend threshold has increased and your save threshold has come down. And how do we service these customers, right? So for us as a digital banking platform, we said, okay, so we're going to really focus on how we're going to service them on the spend side and add additional services on the spend side of the business before we go into the savings product. So that's how we think about digital. And then going back to it is actually from a very onboarding process is to think how we are going to build complex systems to dynamically understand the user behavior, because a user at 22 is so different from the user at 23 and 24 and 25. His likes, preferences, intentions, everything dynamically changes. And from a backend point of view, we're just really trying to figure out how we can really serve them in a much more dynamic fashion based on their requirements.
So clearly a lot has changed since I was doing segmentation a few years back, which is probably no surprise to anybody. You know, it's one thing to take that approach at a company like Cogni, but maybe if we can just turn it over to Mayank. You know, in your role as global head of digital channels at Citi, do you see any similar patterns, or are there any creative ways that you are segmenting your own client base?
So thank you, Michael. And And I think I totally agree with some of the views that Archie just presented. I think the way we look at this particular space is to look at, what exactly is the client wanting the bank to provide, right? So I think in the previous panel, there was a talk about hyper-personalization and, people not wanting to deal with somebody who just provides generic solutions. Everybody is looking for a very, very, very customized or very personalized experience, right? So I think that is pretty much contrary to the concept of segmentation, where you say that particular segment, you could generalize a particular offering. So the way we look at this particular space is trying to understand what is the client trying to do or what is the user trying to do on our platform, and then trying to anticipate the needs that the user had. So some of the needs are you could understand based on the historical patterns, but I think what we have learned from other industries is that that is already table stakes. I think what makes a difference is how do you anticipate, how do you foresee what a particular client wants, and then sort of create a solution around it. Some of this is also driven by looking at the different personas, right? I think you talk about demographics, you talk about geographies. I think all of those are valid, but really a persona of a user, right? So if a CEO is trying to interface with us, right, I think the insights that we give to that particular CEO is what would drive their attention, versus somebody who's a middle office person or somebody who's a retail user who actually just wants to get his job done quickly and move away. So understanding a client and the persona is fundamental to what solution we create for it.
Thank you. In my head, at least, it's quite clear when we talk about things like banking and we talk about things like financial super apps, I can kind of relate to that. I can look at that. But when it comes to things like insurance, and maybe this is a good spot for you to chime in a bit, Vivek, in your role at Northwestern Mutual, where I think you're largely dealing with insurance products, how does this segmentation approach translate into insurance, or does it?
Yeah, great points. I mean, I'm in the life insurance industry, which, by the way, is very digital first, right? That's a joke. So a lot of our time is really spent, 106-year-old company, business model's been working great, relationship-orientated, paper. How do we bring digital into the mix where it enhances the business model, but also keeps in mind that there's the next generation, right? How many times has anyone looked at their mobile app during this panel in the last 10 minutes? You can get a dog walked with a mobile app today in New York. You order seamless Ubers, right? So the world, as we alluded to in the beginning, is moving towards mobile. I get on a company plane every Monday morning and spend 2 days in Milwaukee, and then I spend 2 in New York. So we do look at personas as well, but we also take it to the next step on how are those personas behaving throughout their journey, right? A persona could be very different on a Monday versus a Wednesday. So we really kind of deep dive into that perspective as well. I'll share a quick story. My son's a 5th grader, and we were talking about typing. And he said, "What's typing?" And I said, it's this thing where you type on a keyboard. He's like, "I know how to swipe, but I don't know how to type." So this is the world that we're moving towards. We spend a lot of time looking at our personas, looking at the future generation, even our current customer base, and really building those proactive and adaptive personas over time. Last point I'd say is emotion. Emotion plays a lot into our business model. Listen, it's death, it's money, it's protection. There's a lot of emotional components to it, and having that advisor on the other end is important because it's that trusted person. But how do you kind of enhance and bring the emotional aspects of it? So we spent a lot of time doing customer research, interviews, surveys, getting people in the room and understanding why, right? Not just what they're looking to do, but why are they looking to do it and how are they spending their time? So that's just from my perspective.
Great. And I know, Mark, you're in a unique position because you're looking at things from a vantage point that cuts across a lot of different segments, a lot of different user bases. How does the segmentation theme resonate with you and what you do?
Yeah, at Genpact, I cover banking and capital markets, and we've got over 200 clients in 22 countries. And so I've been able to witness the struggle and the evolution attempting to take place in the banking industry. Frankly, the banking industry does not do this really well. They're still stuck with a lot of the old segmentation that we mentioned about lifestyle. You graduate, when will you need a mortgage, when are you going to buy a car, typical product pushing segmentation around marketing. As they all try to transform to experience, the interactions change, and those customer interactions are unique experiences that create unique segmentation on how you want to manage those experiences for the customers themselves. Obviously, they're all trying to keep up with the data that's associated with that so that they can execute more effectively. Frankly, I still think they're behind, and looking at other companies to come in and advance their ability to do this as they move from more product discipline to an experience discipline and struggle with the transition of that execution, moving from that historical product silo to a customer experience. A car loan versus a car buying experience would be a great example, and how you engage in that regard changes monumentally, and how you segment the customers accordingly changes monumentally.
No, I think that's an important point, and I think when you take that and you couple that with the fact that today consumers, as they make choices, have probably more access to data, comparison shopping, pricing data than they've ever had before, it kind of makes companies lose control to a degree over their marketing message or their brand image, because a lot of data gathering and fact-finding and peer reviews are being done kind of offline, outside the purview of the company. I guess how concretely, when we talk about experience versus products and selling experiences as opposed to products, maybe we can start with Vivek. Is there anything concrete and anything tangible, number one, that you are doing now? And then number two, how are you integrating your services into digital channels that your client base is already familiar with, and you know for a fact that they definitely want to be interacting with you in?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have 4.3 million clients on the life insurance side, and about 3 years ago when I joined, around 120,000 used to use any form of digital. We just crossed 2 million are now using digital. We didn't have mobile apps. This isn't, if you go on the App Store or your Android store, most life insurance companies don't have mobile apps. We have mobile apps now, right? But the point is, we really instrumented and figured out how to bring digital into that life cycle of the user journey. This is not something that you're going to come in every single day. This is not Facebook. This is not Instagram, right? We know that. But how do we plug in some of those components? You always laugh at that one, don't you? But how do we plug in the right components to enhance that relationship? So from the servicing perspective, you need to pay your bills. You need to look at your information, right? How do we make that more self-service and seamless? The other thing I'd say is, another interesting stat is, people used to come to our experience once or twice a year, right? You'd come in, check your bills, make sure things are okay, and you'd move on to Facebook. But how do we get people to stay in the experience or proactively get them to come? So we've built things such as notification engines. You can look at your budgets outside of NM. You can link your external assets. You can see where your money's going, up and down. When I'm watching the Giants lose on Sunday, I can get email alerts and mobile push notifications that reminds me that NM is there, and really brings that and enhances that relationship, right? Every time you come into the digital experience, whether it's a servicing perspective or an experience perspective, call to action is talk to your advisor, right? Get your life in order. So we've really kind of figured out a way to keep that relationship intact, but also use digital to enhance it and introduce it in the right spots instead of making it too disruptive.
Great. And Mayank, in your role at Citi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you cover not only retail user experiences, but also from time to time corporate and treasurer-related user experiences. I'm wondering how this all relates to your role at Citi on the digital side.
Yeah, actually, Michael, my role is solely focused on the institutional side of the business, where the clients are corporates or financial institutions, whether insurance companies or banks. So look, I think fundamentally it has to come down to what makes sense to the customer, right? So in my mind, I think customer experience, if you break it down, the first thing that actually drives the behavior is convenience. If you make the experience convenient, then I think the need to sell or push becomes less important, right? The second thing what we see is that we live in a connected world, and I don't know, there were some statistics that there are 5 trillion IoT devices, and I think where the banking industry is lacking so far is the platform model, right? When we see somebody like CVS and or Walgreens, and we don't know whether they are a pharma company only or a retail company or a toy company as well, banks are not there yet, right? So I think having the connectivity and convenience, drives the customer behavior, and digital is the only way. Luckily, I think we are in a space where the regulators themselves are also pushing for digital. There is a lot of talk about open banking. I was in Canada last week talking about that. So I think we are past the space where we say whether paper or digital. I think we are at a stage where we say what next in digital, right? And how do we make sure that the client owns the data, he has the choice so that he or she can make the right decision for the solution provider.
Great. And Brent, in your role as experience director, I'm sure you have some unique perspective and have had some also equally unique conversations with people on the business side about this topic. Anything you can share from the Bank of America experience so far?
Yeah, I've only been there 2 months. Before that, I was at AIG, so I firmly understand the insurance side of this. It's a struggle. One of the things that I think is really interesting is talking to my business partners is always the push to be able to bring people more on the platform. They want as much screen time as they can, and my question to that is that truly what we should be striving for? Like for me, my focus is always on delivering value for the customer, empathy for the customer, getting ourselves out, the brand and the brand experience out to wherever they are, rather than trying to bring them into the center. Now, certainly I want to have our app and our website to be as efficient, as elegant, as experiential and valuable as possible. But in the end, right, I want to stop there. And it's a bit of a struggle sometimes having that conversation. I think it really comes down to understanding what the user needs, what their plight is, having true empathy for them, and then that conversation becomes simpler, right? The other thing that I've struggled with, and less so at Bank of America, but previous lives, was just that where the brand goes, like what trust the individual user has with our brand. And to some degree, right, they don't trust some of the technological solutions we've come up with. Again and again, we've pushed upon them solutions that were point-in-time, bespoke solutions to help a certain aspect, to deal with a certain problem. But when put all together, it becomes a really negative experience. And I think a lot of what we have to do is dig ourselves out of there. And that might be building less, in my opinion.
And Brent, sticking with that theme, I imagine that there are a lot of great minds now focusing on how technology innovations can be used to solve problems, right? But that presupposes the technology exists first. And we sometimes get into this situation where we've got the technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's machine learning, and now we're figuring out what problems it can solve. But if we think about it for a moment, even though it might be painful from the other direction, uncovering exactly what it is a customer wants, and then figuring out if or whether or how an existing technology is suitable to meeting that need. How do we think about that? And are we sometimes in situations, as I can relate to, where you have someone who's been in a role for 15 years, 20 years, they know their customer, they know exactly what they want, they think they know exactly what they want, and then suddenly there's a discovery that that's not what the customer wants at all. Anything like that resonate in your experience, either with Bank of America or in your prior roles?
That was a long question, but I'll do my best. Is crazy, because there are people there who have so much experience, right? 25 years experience, like always, like perhaps even within the same company, multiple roles certainly, but they really understand their area. And I, being a designer, will never have that depth of knowledge that they have, and that's great. I mean, I can look at things a little bit more, I can look at things a little bit more broadly, and they can really dig in onto the details, and I think that tension is really valuable. To the idea of artificial intelligence, like where can we use that and when is it appropriate? It is dangerous, but also a little needed to be able to look at things that way. But I very much try to go from the user's need out. But I think, again, right, sometimes you have to see, we have a new technology, we want to see where it might be able to be applied, but we shouldn't be doing it just because we have it or just because another bank or another institution has it that we then need it too. And I know there is a little bit of that happening globally. The second part was what again?
Yeah, the second part was, are you frequently or have you ever been in experiences where you're working in a business and you have someone who's covered a client or who's been in a product for years and they think they know exactly what the client wants, and suddenly someone comes in, whether it's an experienced person or a kind person, and uncovers something that's counterintuitive and possibly a little bit provocative.
I mean, I know that, yes. And I'd say that frequently I'll have that conversation. I'll try to find a moment where we can do some upfront, generative research, understanding the user's need, the plight of the user, being able to share that out, that empathy. And quite often I lose, and I think that's my job. My job is to find those moments in time where I can deliver real value and real insight and be able to show that to people and build up that narrative of, let's ask, like, you're probably right. You have 25 years of experience, but why don't we just confirm it by asking a few people and see how that plays out? And I found that it's really powerful when you bring verbatims or video ethnographies into, and show to the clients to be able to say, or my partners to be able to say, hey, don't take it from me, take it from your client, that this is actually something they're frustrated with or something we possibly need to lean in on.
Can I just add? I think what Brent said is absolutely so right. I think there is a space for institutional knowledge, because people need to know how things happen at the back office. But I think the recognition that there is also a space for challenge and design and understanding the journey of a user, and that healthy friction is actually what is needed. So I totally agree with what you said.
Yeah, I do think it's a good point. I always say to my team that if several people from different groups go into a room and try to uncover the right answer or what the customer actually needs, and they come out in 10 minutes and everybody agrees, I said something's dramatically wrong. You've got to go back in and start butting heads a little bit more, right? Mark, I guess in your experience as well, whether it's yourself or whether it's companies that you work with, how best do you and do others uncover the needs that clients have? And are there cases where the initial use case of a product or the initial need of a client turns out to be something different from what made that product ultimately successful?
Yeah, it's interesting that the question's phrased in a product sense, because I think a lot of the banks start with, I've got a lot of data, I've got a lot of products, and I'm trying to figure out how to sell more of those products and make a lot more money. So let's figure out the segmentation, and let's try to get an AI strategy. Let's create a machine learning strategy. It's almost a technology-first approach to the problem that almost forgets entirely about the customer and what outcome you're generally seeking. So what we bump into all the time is a lot of tech-first projects that have spent a lot of money and accomplished very little. There's some great PowerPoint decks on AI, machine learning, whatever else you might want to talk about related to the technology, but there's no outcome that's measurable or meaningful or impacts a customer in a very positive way. So resetting that and understanding specifically what customer outcome are you trying to create, and then using that and working backwards through what are the points of prediction in your data set that would allow you to create that outcome for the customer in the most efficient way, and then transpiring that into the technology that might enable those points of prediction for the betterment of the customer. So I think we're getting better in the industry. I think bright minds like these are starting to understand how to think about this. But in general, categorically, the banks do not think about this properly and have continued to take a technology-first approach with very little outcome.
So we've talked a lot about segmentation. We've talked about experiences, not products. We've talked about uncovering needs of clients and sometimes creating a healthy friction in the process of uncovering those needs. I wonder if you look globally, outside of the US for a moment, are there differences that we see emerging, whether it comes to policy around digital experiences, when it comes to competition, when it comes to different ways that large banks are working with or purchasing or partnering with fintech companies? Curious if there are any differences and patterns that you see emerging. In my mind, I'm not sure if the panel would agree, but in my mind, the one way I look at it is China, for example, seems to me like the pattern of development and engagement there is a lot different from what I might be used to sitting here in New York, in the sense that you tend to see large banks. I think Bank of China and Tencent were working together a couple of years ago, China Commercial Bank or China Construction Bank and Alibaba, if I'm not mistaken. But the banks tend to be working with big tech more than fintech or small tech, was one observation that I had. Are there other patterns? Number one, do you agree that that's the case? And then number two, are there other patterns and differences, even on the regulation side, that you see emerging? And maybe, Mark, you can start us off.
Yeah, take you on a little tour around the world and just give you my perspective on it. I do think China, Asia in general is really aggressive. You see things like Ant Financial pumping up that have a higher market value than the Bank of China itself, with less than 10,000 employees. So born in the cloud, digital companies are advancing aggressively. If you get into other areas, if you look at Australia and what's happening there with the Royal Commission, really putting a regulatory burden into the banking industry, they're spending 70 or 80% of their time looking backwards and explaining what they've done historically as a company versus looking forward and digitally transforming towards experiences and the like. If you look at Europe, it's a big wait and see game. What's going to happen with Brexit? Where are we all going to go? How will I find sources and uses of capital to drive the transformation that I'm looking for? So it's a very slow-moving process with a lot of profitable banks that I frankly think sit there and say, we're making a lot of money. What do we need to change and why? I think the U.S. has started to realize that transformation is necessary, and some of the better banks took advantage of the downturn in 2008 and 9 and managed their earnings and reinvested into their transformation, I think, very, very successfully. And I think Canada's starting to wake up as well to say, look, steady course and speed is not going to be effective. We've got to be vastly more efficient and vastly more customer aware. And so I'm seeing a lot of early strategy out of Canada to make some of the changes that we've talked about.
And it's refreshing to hear you use the word transformation as opposed to disruption. So whenever people talk about disruption, I said, that's great, but just make sure in the process of disruption, you're not causing mass chaos. So I'm glad that the industry is moving towards,
there's a little of that too.
Different vocabulary, right? Archie, I wonder on your side if you've experienced any differences or any geographical or jurisdictional differences, either in your business or any of your prior work.
It was very interesting to know when you mentioned that banks are thinking technology first. For Cogni, we want to be technology informed, we want to be product informed, we want to be design informed, but we want to be purpose driven. That's what gets customers. Millennials and Generation Z are hyper informed. They can make or break a business. Consumer is at the heart of whatever we do. And especially when trying to compete with banks or bigger platforms, which have a ton of dollars under their belt. Obviously, the biggest challenge is human talent. And how do we bring the smartest of human talent under your fold to put your product out there and take a market share in the business is to be purpose-driven. So most companies that I know which are changing the landscape are a lot more purpose-driven globally. And as I earlier mentioned, I am a very strong believer of singularity, moving into a digital phase. Whether it's WeChat, started as a messaging platform and then evolved into a super app. In India, you have Paytm that started as a payments app and then became a super app, and then you have Grab in Singapore, started as a transportation app and then became a super app. So. Or even, for example, the future of businesses, it'd be Tesla is not a car company. Tesla is it's an energy company. So from a Cogni perspective, Cogni means cognitive. So we are a data company. So we using data, bringing banking, commerce, and lifestyle onto one single application. And we believe that the next level of super apps would be a transnational super app, where users would be able to take the data and passport the data into different parts of the world. So one of my largest investors is a $100 billion fund based in Asia. They run one of the largest life insurance company. And one of the biggest challenges, how do you sell life insurance to a 22-year-old kid, right? He's not thinking about dying soon. And so we were debating about the whole fact of saying, like, pay as you live model. Is there something we could do there? And we are looking at dating. Does bank even think about dating, right? You have Bumble, Tinder, and all these dating sites, and then you end up, meeting the wrong people. You don't want to date somebody with, less financial discipline. We all want to date people who have very good financial discipline because that's the future, right? You don't want to waste your time. Ask a girl and they would tell you that. And So even if you look at WeChat, for example, they tend to match people based on their credit scores. So from a Cogni perspective, we always think about, can we get into spaces like that? Can we look into ride sharing? With Tesla going into Model 3, they want to start creating robo-taxis. So as a platform, can we get into transportation? Can we get into product discovery? Before we even think about selling financial products to them. So that's how we are thinking through the entire ecosystem. And our purpose is about making sure that data benefits to the user, and how that data could be transported from wherever they travel, could be transported into our ecosystem anywhere in the world, so they have product discovery, payments, services, so making payments disappear below their discovery process. So that's how we are thinking through that ecosystem, and that's what we're working towards. So that's a trend that we are really seeing, looking beyond financial services, beyond selling financial products, getting into their entire lifestyle experiences.
And if I can ask, how does this actually work? So you'd go onto a dating website and you would actually be prompted to buy life insurance, or you would only
no.
The fact that you have life insurance.
So this is how I envision this, right? So if I'm going to come and sell you a life insurance policy, you're going to have a sense of aversion towards me. This guy is going to sell you something. How about I take you to a beer? Let me understand who you are as a person. And you would always, your best recommendation comes from your peers, right? Not through ads. Gone are the days that when you see a huge celebrity out there and you want to buy the product. Then came influencers, right? Influencers came in, and then influencers took a micro share because it was reachable. People can reach that influencer level. The next future is peer-to-peer recommendation. If a friend with a great hair, right, and he's got a great hair, he uses a great hair product, and if he recommends you the hair product, you have some kind of understanding because you can see that. So these evolutions are happening in a very consistent way. So when I mean by dating, you don't have to go to another dating site to sell financial product. Let them date. Make them happy, right? And eventually, when the time comes, you would be able to sell products and services that you want. So you don't have to stuff, it's a top line versus bottom line, right? Everybody wants to make money. So this is something that, some of the investors who have invested in us and the investors that we always talk to is like, they are willing to wait for 20 years, right? Capture the customer, let them get engaged with you, serve them, and then you can always sell later. And it comes as part of the process, not stuff something on someone's face. Because people, if you look at eBay, for example, eBay has less than 3%, they go to, and less than 3% actually convert. Everyone else drops the checkout because people are hyper-informed because they think that they can always get a better deal after better deal after better deal. So nothing really works. So instead, provide a great experience that people get resonate to. They can come to your platform, do other things. Right? And then once you gain your trust, obviously you kind of like build an ecosystem within that so they don't have to leave that ecosystem. So that comes from dating as well, so know how to sell life insurance. You don't have to so make their experience what you're doing better and then integrate them into their lifestyle.
It's a fascinating perspective. It reminds me, this is probably a topic of another panel, hopefully in the future. It does seem to me like people nowadays like to be scored. They like to know how they're ranking, how they're performing, versus different criteria. And I can't remember if it was Qzone or Sesame Credit in China that created a similar structure where based on your score, you might be able to qualify for a faster visa, expedited visa, or a higher score on dating sites. So this whole concept, this theme of being scored, counterintuitively to me, seems to be something that is part and parcel of where we're heading. So maybe just one more question for the panel. So we started with segmentation. Let's turn segmentation on its head for this question and say, is there a sweet spot when it comes to client demand or unmet needs? Is there a common denominator where it doesn't matter the generation, it doesn't matter the education level, it doesn't matter the geography, but every client at least needs these one or two things? Is there something close to a common denominator in terms of unmet need or problem statement or use case that you've ever come across? And the answer might very well be no. But maybe we can start with Vivek.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think one of the things that I've realized in especially the financial services industry is education. and emotion. One of the things, we did a segment study about our top mobile users. Of course, we thought it was going to be millennials, and they were number one. Number two were 55 to 65. The reason is they're using FaceTime to talk to their grandkids. They're using some of the technologies. My dad's on Snapchat. I'm not even on Snapchat. So one of these things that we've come to realize is that emotion plays a good role as well, and that's something that's consistent across all the demographics and customers that we looked at. The other thing I'd say is education. Fun stats that 6 to 8 hours a day are still lost over sleep for millennials when it comes to financial literacy, right? Ironically, the same was for me, same was for my dad. So how can we bring into the digital experiences that we build, whether it's any generation or any demographic, a good platform or a good mechanism to educate? And it goes back to what Archie was saying, really tapping into the lifestyle. Really, so we focus a lot on personalization, learning about you, and then providing you the right education material, right education experiences that really help, and eventually help bring that emotional component together. So I'm a firm believer that educating and tapping into emotion and lifestyle are two commonalities that I've seen across a lot of customer bases.
Thank you. And Mayank, it might be a little bit of a stretch on the institutional side, or maybe it's not, you'll correct me. Is there sort of a common denominator or close to a common denominator when it comes to institutions, or is it just so far dispersed and it's too complex to even try to simplify?
No, I think there is, I think what Vivek said makes perfect sense. I mean, for us, our institutional business is across 100 countries, so we see a lot of different pace of change in different countries, different behavior patterns. But one thing that is fundamental to everybody is the empathy, right? As a service provider, do you have the empathy for your customer, right? If you have the right empathy for the customer, that's when you win the right to earn their business. There is actually no entitlement for anybody's business, right? None of us are entitled to have clients. None of us are entitled to have businesses, right? It's what we do by understanding the customers and having that empathy gives us the right to earn the business.
Fascinating. Well, everyone, I'm going to leave it at that. Are just about out of time, but this has been a fascinating conversation for me. I certainly learned a lot. Hopefully everyone benefited from the perspective. But thank you very much again for joining us here today, and thanks for your attention.